the GRASP Webcast, The Experts Speak. My name is Doug Kress, and I'm the coordinator of the Great Apes Survival Partnership. I'm speaking to you from our headquarters in Nairobi, Kenya. And today we'll be speaking with experts on the issues of fires and haze and the environmental crisis currently occurring across Southeast Asia, the impact it's having on orangutans and other wildlife in the area, and the possibility for impact on the climate change conference currently underway in Paris, and how we can avoid this sort of environmental crisis in the future. For a bit of background on this, in June of this year, the annual clearance of land in Indonesia for paper and palm oil development began. This occurs every year. It's a way of clearing land for development. With the long dry season mixed with the El Nino meteorological conditions, whipped this particular series of fires this year out of control. Within weeks, NASA satellites were able to detect over 130,000 fire hotspots moving across Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and elsewhere in the region. And it threatened the rainforest and habitats of endangered orangutans, as well as many of the people living in the region. An estimated 1/3 of the remaining wild orangutans in Borneo were threatened directly by the fires and their rapid spread. But worse still, the large peat deposits underground caught fire and began to burn out of control and burn in ways that were highly unpredictable, only adding to the crisis. And it caused massive clouds of haze to fill the air that began to blanket Southeast Asia. In some places, the visibility was reduced to 30 meters as a result of the haze. And at one point in Kuala Lumpur, it was impossible to see across the street whether the traffic light had turned green or red. 500,000 people were treated for respiratory infections as a result of the haze. 19 people are known to have died, and the damage is still being counted. The CO2 equivalent of these fires, the carbon emissions of these fires, were equal to the entire emissions in a single year of major industrialized nations like the United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, and Brazil. And the cost to the government of Indonesia is estimated in excess of $30 billion. Where do we go from here? This is an environmental crisis that is still underway. There's been rain, but the fires continue. And relief efforts have been well-intentioned, but is it possible to ever get ahead of a crisis of this level? At the Great Apes Survival Partnership, we're pleased to have recently received a donation from the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil for $100,000 to go towards relief efforts. But as I said before, it's a $30 billion environmental crisis. How do we get on top of something so dramatic, so devastating, and yet so predictable? Well, we're joined today for this GRASP webcast by 4 experts who have different perspectives on this crisis. We have Dr. Eric Maillard with us from Jakarta. Eric is the Science Director for the Borneo Futures Initiative. Here in Nairobi, we have Jamie Webb, Program Manager for the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP. In Malaysia, we have Harjinder Clare Haji, who's the manager of the Hutan organization that works with orangutans in Borneo. And joining us from Paris, where he's attending the climate change conference that began yesterday, we have Panat Hadistiwoyo, who is the director of the Orangutan Information Center. I'd like to welcome all of our guests today. And I'd like to start, if I could, in discussing this issue by starting with you, Eric Maillard. You are the expert that coined the phrase, this is the worst environmental crime of the 21st century. And I'm curious, what makes this a crime, and how devastating is this crime?
Well, thanks, Doug, for the introduction. I called it a crime. I think that needs to be decided in court ultimately whether it's a crime or not. I mean, it's clearly a disaster, and I call it the biggest environmental man-made disaster of the 21st century simply because I couldn't find a bigger one. A totally man-made and, as you say, predictable and preventable environmental disaster affecting up to possibly 80 million people in the Southeast Asian region, massive impacts on, as you said, on global climate change with vast carbon emissions, on loss of tropical rainforests, and indeed of a major effect or impact on tropical wildlife, including orangutans. And I mean, I looked at other big disasters like the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2012, And if I compared it to me, the fires that are in Indonesia in 2015 are just much bigger in impact. And I think what's really happening is that everyone is sort of looking at these fires, and I've had many discussions with journalists, and they go, yeah, it's Indonesia, they have their fires every year, and we're kind of bored with the whole subject. So there's kind of a need to really call things what they are. It is a really big environmental and social problem that happens all the time. It happened more severely this time because of the very severe El Nino-related drought conditions, and that really blew everything out of proportion, having an impact that is way beyond what we've had before. And the thing isn't over yet. We know that El Nino will continue until way into 2016. So further dry conditions are predicted for certainly eastern Indonesia, central Indonesia, probably leading to more fires as well. So now whether this is a crime or not is a different question. I think it's a crime insofar that it has major negative impacts. It involves illegal activities insofar as it involves illegal clearing of land. I mean, ultimately, I think this needs to be put on the agenda of institutions that can make a call about this. I mean, how do you deal with this if it is indeed an illegal activity? Who is responsible? Is it the CEOs of big companies? Is it the people that run the governments of these different countries that are involved, and so on? I'd like to look more into this and see what you can really do with calling this a crime and making it stand out for what it really is in my eyes.
Great, thank you, Eric. You've elevated this already to a discussion at a global level. So let me turn now to Jamie Webb here in the UN offices in Nairobi. Jamie, you've been very closely involved in formulating some of the policy positions, some of the statements, and some of the reactions from the United Nations. How seriously is this being taken by the United Nations, both the UN Environment Program here in Nairobi, but also the Secretary General in New York?
Thank you. I think for the UN, it's seen as from the perspective both as an environmental issue, but also a regional and global issue. From the environmental side, certainly UNEP is looking at things like the destruction of orangutan habitats. We are tying it into the destruction of peatlands. If you go back to the 1970s, for example, most of the peatlands were forested in Indonesia. By 2010, 72% of Sumatrans forests had disappeared. About half of Kalimantan's had been deforested, and degradation throughout the rest of Indonesia was quite severe, leading to the dry conditions in peat areas, which resulted in these fires being so serious. So from our perspective, we look at peatland management, restoration, sustainable use as some key issues that are really driving our engagement in Indonesia and certainly have an impact on the fires. On the regional level, because the toxic haze is not confined to Indonesia, it's spreading throughout Southeast Asia, we look at the role that the UN can play in helping to ensure regional stability, reaching this Asian haze-free by 2020 target. Certainly we put our support behind that objective and would like to see how the UN can assist in that. We are also looking at helping to identify exactly how the haze is impacting human health. So for us, it's a human health issue. And if you look at what's common throughout the elements I've just described, they can all be linked back to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals touch on human well-being, sustainable development, and the long-term health of our planet, our economy, and our people.
Thank you, Jamie. I'd like to turn now to Haji Claire in Borneo. Haji, we're well aware that you're in the Malaysian section of Borneo in the northeast, but I'm curious what your general view has been on the ground there in terms of impact. And although most of this haze and fire seems to be moving north and west, perhaps, what has been the impact for you there in Borneo and on the island itself?
Okay, for our team in the field, they said that this was the worst they've ever seen a haze, and they needed at one point like even lights just to go down the river, and so that was something quite new for them as well. Yet what we experienced here in the northern part of Borneo was nothing as bad as, of course, what happened in Indonesia and what was happening in Singapore and Malaysia, other parts of Peninsular Malaysia. So there's also a culture here of Malaysian culture of blaming everything on the Indonesian side as well. And this is something that needs to change in Malaysia, because we immediately just pointed fingers and went, it's the Indonesians, it's their fault, it's got nothing to do with us, they need to be more responsible. And that's absolutely wrong, because we are also partly responsible for what happened there with the burning.
There's also a global perception, rightly or wrongly, that Borneo is by itself an island, and whether it's Malaysia, whether it's Brunei, whether it's Indonesia, the entire island has this issue. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely, it is a fair assessment in the sense that there's a culture of burning, and Eric wrote about this, so he should speak more on this. There's a culture of burning, and even while the burning was happening and coming towards us from the Indonesian side, they were as regular small farmers in Sabah as well as in Sarawak, I'm sure, who continued doing their little burning. And then when you ask them why they're burning when it's so hazy, their answer is like, oh, ours is fine. This is not the one that's causing the haze. That's coming from Indonesia. So there's still a lack of understanding.
Understood. I'd like to now turn to Pana Hadisuwoyo, who is with us from Paris, where he's attending the climate change conference that got underway yesterday. Pana, I'm curious if these fires, this haze, this environmental crisis is being talked about much in the conference itself, and do you think do you think it will have an impact on any of the decisions that come out of the conference?
Okay, in my view, I'm a bit worried that the Paris COP21 is only talking the talk, without having any real impact on the ground. For example, like our President Jokowi actually talked about, how to prevent fires, how to address with the fire problem, but actually he doesn't have any detailed plan. There is no action plan actually to really, being used for tackling the future fires, And he talked about, seeking funds actually to help Indonesia to reduce emission, but not actually addressing how the fire is being tackled in a short period before it happens, in a big scale next year, And it seems that El Nino is always on the blame, but actually, I would say that fires in Indonesia is preventable and is not natural disaster. It's a man-made disaster, and I would agree with Eric. It is a big crime that affect the whole ecosystem, humans, wildlife, and Jokowi coming to Paris, talking about the fires, reducing emission, but actually it should be done at current, at the current time in Paris to actually negotiate, not actually focusing on the seeking funds to help Indonesia, because at the bottom line, it is Indonesian responsibility to address the fires, and law enforcement become the priority. And it seems that that law enforcement is not really being addressed properly during the COP21. So it's just all talking about the El Nino, climate change that possibly trigger the fires, but actually at the bottom line, underground, so many things need to be done. With the action plans that actually need to be developed now. Otherwise, we have no time to prepare for the next fires.
Indonesia imposed.
I would say,
so go ahead, Eric.
No, I was gonna say that I fully agree with Panutan that I mean, we all talk about this. This is a really big problem that is really hard to prevent. Actually, it's not. There has just not been any political commitment and very clear political guidance to, in any shape or form, say no to fires. And what is sort of mixed in here is that, I mean, fire has a traditional use, not just in Indonesia. Many places in the world use fires, communities use fires to open up land for development. And that sort of undermines, I think, the political commitment to saying something very clear about fires. There's sometimes the perception that Indonesian cannot get its act together, but I've seen it happen in the past. Once the government is committed to something, whether it's like stopping illegal logging and so, and they put the resources behind it and they make very clear public statement about what is allowed and what is not allowed, Indonesia is perfectly able to implement these things. But what I've not seen so far at all is any kind of political consensus at the national and at the local level to start saying something very clear about fires, whatever that is, whether there is a full fire ban during times of the biggest fire risk, like during extremely dry periods, or it's a total fire ban in certain areas, whatever. There's never been any clarity on this at all. And if there's no clarity, everyone will just go and do whatever they want, so you'll never solve the problem. Excuse me.
So, but in 2011, the government of Indonesia banned fires and the land clearance, and yet they're still occurring. Is that simply just a lack of enforcement? Eric?
Well, I don't know whether it was fully banned or the rule to allow people to burn 2 hectares was already in place then. So during the 2015, it depends a bit where you looked in Indonesia, because like different provinces and different districts have their separate bylaws. But in general, the perception was among the people that burning up to 2 hectares was allowed. Now, I've been looking at the sort of the standard or the average traditional burn that people do. So people use fire to open up land in the shifting cultivation systems. Very few people actually burn as much as 2 hectares. That number is way too high. But the more important problem, I think, is that, I mean, who controls? I mean, who controls whether you're a traditional farmer or you're a speculating, small-scale speculating, medium-sized oil palm guy, or someone who hands out money for someone else to go burning under that guise of I'm doing things because I'm allowed it because I'm a poor farmer. And I think these kind of things make it so hard to implement anything. But there's always this kind of gray area. Is it legal? Is it illegal? Well, no one seems to know. But that makes it so hard to say anything clear in terms of law enforcement. Then law enforcement doesn't happen.
Let me take a step back for 1 second and go to Jamie for 1 minute here. We're talking about fires. We're talking about haze. We're talking about peat. We're being a bit, maybe a bit too quick with some of these terms. Jamie, give us a sense of what peat fires are and why haze from peat fires, for instance, might be more dramatic and more damaging than traditional fires with just smoke.
Absolutely. I think one of the big, well, there's 2 aspects to this. The first is how the fires burn, and the second is what the fires release. So peat is quite different from other soil. It has high carbon content, and when it's in good condition, it's quite moist. But it's also very, very deep compared to a lot of soils. What that means is that when peat fires burn, they don't just burn on the surface, they also burn underground because of their high carbon content. This makes them very difficult to put out, because you could put out the surface fires in an area and then come back 1 or 2 or 3 days later and the fire has reemerged. Essentially, it moves underground and pops back to the surface when it can find vegetation to burn. So what we've seen in the past, following the 1997 to 98 fires, there was a massive investment in Indonesia to make sure that these fires would never happen again. And there was a lot of training done for building capacity to fight the fires. But the training was often done using methods for fighting fires in traditional forests. Those methods don't work very well on peat. When peat does burn, it releases what we call toxic haze. Haze, smoke from peat fires, has a number of chemicals, particulate matter in it that you don't find in regular forest fire smoke. It contains things like formaldehyde, aluminum, carbon monoxide, ozone, cyanide. And when people are inhaling these toxic chemicals, over short-term exposure, you can have respiratory difficulties and dizziness and headaches. Over the long term, the implications are much more severe. That's why at the UN we're looking at conducting a comprehensive study on the long-term exposure to the health risks from long-term exposure to the toxic haze from these fires, and hopefully paired with what we know already about the short-term exposure risks, we can get a complete picture of how this toxic haze really is impacting the people in the region.
Thank you. Let me turn to Haji for a second. Quite often, palm oil is loosely used to blame, or is loosely blamed for almost every environmental disaster in Southeast Asia, and particularly in Indonesia. You've worked with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. I'm curious, 2 things. One, is it fair to blame oil palm development for this particular crisis? And would it make any difference, or does it make any difference, if a plantation is sustainable in terms of palm oil development in regard to fires?
Okay, I'm going to move the conversation a little bit back to Malaysia, because I don't think it's fair for me to speak here about Indonesia. We support the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil because one of the criteria is there's no burning. And the reason that this is important in Malaysia, just as in Indonesia, is that Sarawak at the moment has planted about 1 million hectares of oil palm, and they're planning to go up to 2.5 million. And a lot of these areas that they want to open up in the future, they're on peat. So if they do it in a fire-burning way, it's going to create a massive problem that's going to be even worse for Malaysia and also going to affect Indonesia in the future. So, of course, this is another reason why we are supporting RSPO and another reason why the oil palm industry can be blamed. And unfortunately, in Malaysia and Indonesia, the oil palm industry, some people in it, still use burning methods to clear for land. That's not going to change unless they buy into international certifications like RSPO.
That certainly is encouraging if there is an option going forward, but it sounds as if it's not being implemented yet in a broad enough manner to really guarantee that these fires won't occur each year. Is that fair?
Yes, that's a fair assessment to say. Having said that, I know RSPO worked very hard to make sure that their members were not burning this year. But does it matter if you're not burning and your neighbors are burning? So that's where RSPO has to go beyond, because even if you're not burning and your neighbors are burning, it's still going to be just as equally bad.
True. Well, we've talked a lot about habitat and about peat and some of the broader issues. Let me ask you, Panit, what has been the direct impact on orangutans? We have orangutans in Sumatra critically endangered. We have orangutans in Borneo endangered. What have you seen in your work in terms of how these fires have impacted that species, those species?
Yeah, I must say that I focus on Sumatra in the lesser ecosystem, and luckily, actually, this year the lesser ecosystem has less fires compared to other places in Indonesia. I think this is because law enforcement really work, promoted by civil society organizations, actually, that resulted in law enforcement and persecution of companies involved in burning, in clearing the lands, and that really big impact. So in terms of your question asking me about the impact of fires, like on orangutans, it's obviously just the same like humans, where we actually highly affected, and we don't know, who knows, that actually orangutan in course they burn actually also highly affected by the heat, the way they actually have to move or roam in the natural habitat must be strongly affected by the heat and fires. And of course, not just that. In our case, even during the fires happened a lot in Indonesia. So we actually found orangutan pushed out from the forest, and because actually the area was fragmented and isolated, and the company actually burning the fire, so then burning the forest. And that actually pushed the orangutans to come up from the natural habitat. And not only that, I think I believe there is no such big research on actually measuring the impact on the natural vegetation and wildlife, including orangutans. So I think it's more like losing habitat. It's losing their home, losing their place to survive. And then I think with fires coming in and then keep actually attacking orangutans, and that is a big threat for the survival in the future.
Our understanding from many of the GRASP partners who do the rescue and rehabilitation is that all the rescue centers are full beyond capacity at this point. More orangutans are coming in. There's a tremendous number of shortfalls of manpower, of funding, and so forth. For you, Panit, would you regard this as being the worst year, perhaps, for orangutan conservation that you've encountered, or have there been worse?
I think in total in Indonesia, about almost 3,000 orangutan have been sent to the quarantine of the last 10 years. So the bottom line is not just fires, but actually losing the habitat. Losing the habitat actually triggering access to area for poaching, and loss of chance for many wildlife, including orangutan, to actually find food naturally, and then have to end up in cage because people actually So but the bottom line is fire is a momentum actually, but deforestation, loss of habitat is actually stronger message to be delivered to the government of Indonesia that now we have more orangutans coming in, and in Sumatra around 30 orangutans sent to the quarantine every year, and I don't really know the detail about in Kalimantan, but I believe there are at least more than 1,000 orangutans still in the quarantine, and seems the number never actually decreased, and more orangutans being sent to the quarantine, and of course, to answer your questions about if fire is really the worst case for orangutan, I would say so, because in the last 3 months, for example, like in Borneo, there are, or by IR actually rescue almost 30 orangutans in 1 month, because of the fires. So obviously, yes.
Well, those are certainly devastating numbers. Any organization taking in 30 orangutans in a short period of time has a great deal to deal with. Let me ask you a question, Eric. If we've talked about these fires now, and they were, as has been said, a predictable catastrophe, and if they happen every year, and we know when the El Nino cycles occur, what is it going to take to have this crisis not reoccur, either annually or during the El Nino cycles?
I think there's got to be a clear decision from the Indonesian government to draw some lines. And that requires probably international pressure as well as maybe international support. As long as there's no clear policy action there, that the government says, whatever they're going to say, let's say a full fire ban on peatlands, which I think would be a wise thing to do. As Jamie was saying, I mean, peatlands create smoke and haze that is far worse than any smoke from any other land uses. But more than that, we know that the development of coastal peatland is unsustainable. Peats are not soils; they're organic matter. As soon as you start draining them, they will decompose. They will eventually just disappear and be flooded. So there are many reasons to not have any development on peatlands and restore these peatlands, restore the hydrology, make sure no new fires come in, and develop crops or replant forests there that maintain that natural ecosystem. That I think for a start would really be a really big step forward for the Indonesian government. And for what I understand is that's what the government are talking about at the moment. Now, as Panut was saying, it's one thing to say something in public and say this is what we're going to do. It's quite another thing to actually do it on the ground and make sure it happens. And that's where political commitment and international assistance and some clear law enforcement. Ultimately, if you, the government, say this is no longer allowed, put the means behind it to make sure that indeed it doesn't happen. And again, going back to what I was saying earlier, that clarity just hasn't been there enough. The government has been saying one way or the other way, and it's just not been clear enough, and it's not been enforced on the ground. I'm absolutely convinced that the Indonesian government can solve this problem of fires. We can go into 2016 or 2017 and reduce the fires by 90% if only they get their act together and show that commitment. I know that they can do that.
And just to follow up on that, though, you mentioned international assistance, but international pressure, would that work?
Well, it goes back to this issue of crime, where I think the issues are related. There's been in the feeling in Southeast Asia, and Haji talked about Malaysia, but also in Singapore and all the way into Brunei and Thailand and the Philippines. There's a lot of people out there in the region that are pretty annoyed with Indonesia at the moment for this annual reoccurring of haze. So I think regionally, within the framework of ASEAN, the group of countries together in Southeast Asia, there are opportunities there, and there is a framework there under which the haze problem could be addressed, and that needs to be discussed at the political level. But I think also what is happening now in Paris provides opportunities. I mean, it's not just a regional fire problem, it's a major contribution, as you mentioned, to global carbon emissions, and that could reoccur every year if the problem isn't solved. And I think at the moment in this world where we really are coming to the threshold of major environmental disasters that could occur, we're just not in a position to let this go. So it then goes back to this question: when is this a crime? And are there opportunities to really put pressure on the government to start addressing this seriously? Because the world is fed up with Indonesia not doing enough about it. And these things are never easy. And I'm sure Indonesia wouldn't like that. But I think we've come to the point that enough is enough, and that something clear needs to be done. And I'd like to see more international collaboration, countries getting together, but also talking to Indonesia to see how that problem can be solved.
Well, if you're going to mention international collaboration, let me bring Jamie back in for a moment. You'll be going to the climate change COP, I believe, later this week, Jamie. But also you work very closely with the UN RED program, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. And I'm curious if that could play a role in helping Indonesia get control of this environmental crisis, in your opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's important to bear in mind at the moment is that Indonesia has submitted its emission reduction commitments. However, their emission reduction commitments don't take into account the impacts of fire on their carbon emissions. And until that is done, until the international community assists Indonesia to say, how are these fires going to affect your ability to meet your commitments that you're making at the UNFCCC, at these climate change conferences, unless you understand how you can integrate fire management and how fire management, peatland restoration is going to become an integral part of your climate change commitments, Indonesia is set up to fail. So from the UN RED program side, we have a large RED Plus that's reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, but it also looks at forest restoration and the conservation of forest stocks. We have a large program in Indonesia, which we anticipate will probably continue. But we do require more international support. One of the key commitments that have been made recently is the New York Declaration on Forests, in which private sector contributed to deforestation-free commodity supply chains. There's a need now to really look at how those commodities can be prioritizing those, I think we can prioritize those commodities that are contributing to the fire risk in Indonesia. So there's the climate change commitments, there's the private sector deforestation-free supply chain commitments. In addition to that, there's the regional commitments, as I mentioned before, the Haze-free Asian by 2020 commitment. These need to be supported. They need to be supported by national policies. They need to be supported by international commitments. They need to be supported by solid analytical work so that we truly understand the problem before we move ahead to try to solve it.
We've talked about government assistance and perhaps government pressure, but let me ask you, Haji, is this one of those cases where perhaps private companies and private pressure might have a better result? Some of the corporations that are fairly or unfairly blamed for these crises are major players right there in Indonesia and Malaysia and Southeast Asia. Could they play a better leadership role, do you think?
Doug, I think that is actually the answer. I don't hold out much for government intervention in a good way, because, for example, ASEAN, they talk a lot. They're very slow in getting things done. And another example is that as soon as the haze disappeared, it disappeared from our newspapers as well. And ministers who were scrambling to continuously meet and they couldn't meet, I don't know why, they haven't heard of Skype, but they couldn't get to Jakarta or KL or Singapore or Kuching. And then as soon as the haze disappeared from the skies, they weren't rushing to meet. At the end of the day, I think it's going to be the consumers, it's going to be industry that can make the real change. And industry is affected, not just by bad names, but again, I read an article Eric wrote about yields going down because of the cover of the smoke. So I think it has to be industry. I want to see industry play a bigger role. I do not hold out much for the ASEAN group to play a bigger role. They're pretty slow. They get you lines to queue for immigration. I think that's the biggest impact I've seen ASEAN do.
Well, let me ask you now, Pandit, if any combination of government pressure or government support or private leadership or private support can take hold, can it take hold in time to actually ensure the long-term survival of orangutans and their habitat? Are we really at a tipping point right now where we would lose Sumatran orangutans or lose Bornean orangutans, or is there still time?
The only way is actually the government must lead the action. If the government fails to lead the action, then everything will fail. And we, civic society organizations, will support any initiative, and we have all initiatives to actually make it possible that no fires in the future. And we want the community and the global community want zero fires in Indonesia. And the only way to do that is actually by really stopping any clearing of lands, especially on peatlands, and actually addressing the mass deforestation on peatlands. Without actually addressing this issue, then we're gonna fail. And we need now, not next year, to prepare the fires, but we need now. And without now, then we actually will in the same circle. Like as Haze said, that now everybody's happy. Coming to Paris, talking that we have a commitment, but commitment is not enough. Commitment must be actually put into practice. That has to be done by anyone. Law enforcement must work. And no any form of fires, regardless of the size of how many hectares they're allowed to burn, but that should be revised. The law should be revised and implemented. We have already good laws, with protecting the environment. We are actually, already banned to burn the land. I mean, when we do clearing the land, so it's all in the law, but there's no implementation on the ground. That now is the time. It's good momentum. So yeah, of course, we need cooperation with all kind of sectors. Government, private sectors, civic society, society organizations. And that's the only way. We don't want to be a single hero, and then we must work, all together to actually address the problem. But the government must lead the action.
We're coming to the close of our time on this webcast, and this is a very heavy and in some ways a very sad environmental crisis we're talking about. But let's try and leave it on a slightly higher note, if there is that. I'd like to ask each of you if you do have hope for the future, and if there is a possibility that we can get ahead of this environmental crisis, that these fires and haze are not an annual issue, and if there's anything in particular that you think needs to be done in, say, the next year to 5 years. Eric, let's start with you.
Yeah, I've been working here for 25 years, and I wouldn't have worked here for 25 years if I didn't believe that something good could come out of this. Indonesia is going through its deforestation curve, like many other countries in the past have done, and it will bottom out at some place. Now the question is when and what's left by the time it bottoms out and starts growing up again. And how can we move that point forward in time, so by the time Indonesia starts to realize that for every decision you make on land use, there is a benefit, and we all know what the benefit is. If you cut down the forest and you plant oil palm instead, or you plant another crop there, we know there's money to be made. What we don't know is the costs that are associated with that, and the costs are manifold. They are in terms of haze, they are in terms of increased flooding, they are in terms of temperature changes, and we know very little about that. At some stage, people will realize, and the Indonesian government will realize, that it's actually much better to retain a certain area of forest in your land, and that's absolutely crucial to the functioning of a healthy state. They'll come to that point, and what I'm just trying to do is move that point forward and see if we can get there more quickly, get people to understand that they need to make wiser decisions than they're doing at the moment. So I would like to leave this on an optimistic note. Yes, we can change that. It's going to take some hard work. It's going to take some hard convincing. But the pressure is on the Indonesian government now to show that they can do something else. And I'm pretty confident that they'll, over the years, we'll get there.
Great. Let's go to you now, Jamie. Same question. Are you hopeful?
Absolutely. I think the world has now woken up to the environmental crisis, the human health crisis that is occurring in Indonesia because of the fires. The Secretary General of the United Nations has put it on the top of his agenda. He's requested more information, ideas for how the UN can support. The private sector has woken up. They're adopting stricter voluntary guidelines on the use of peatlands and how they manage them. The government has woken up. It's starting to review its policies. It's starting to look at its fiscal incentive frameworks and how they're contributing to fire risk. Consumers have woken up. At the height of the fire crisis, I was getting multiple posts on my Facebook page every day with pictures of orangutans fleeing the fires, people wearing masks. So the world has woken up. What we need to do now is we need to come together to transform these good intentions into action.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Haji, let's go to you in Malaysia now. And what's your sense and your sense of hope for the future?
Okay, well, I've read newspaper articles that date back to 1972 talking about the haze problem. So, I mean, we should have gotten our act together years ago, and, you know, this shouldn't be happening today. But having said that, I am hopeful for the future, but my hope does not lie in government. It lies in industry, and it lies in the consumers. And I've seen the industry change the last 5 years more than it has previously. And so I think that we can make this happen. And from the government side, what we need is enforcement, enforcement, enforcement. Like Panut said, we have the laws.
Great. And Panut, let's finish with you now. You again are in Sumatra, although currently in Paris at the Climate Change Conference. You're surrounded by politics, but do you have hope?
Yeah, I've been working to save the orangutan in their habitats for the last 15 years, and for that years also I see and witness destructions in Sumatra. In the lesser ecosystem, since 70, actually we lost almost 3,000 hectares of forest in the lesser ecosystem. That is just a period of 35 years. So even in 2014, like almost 20,000 hectare of forest in the lesser ecosystem actually gone. Mainly because the expansion of plantation. So seeing the destruction, seeing what we are doing together, creating initiative to do actions on the ground is, I think, probably I would say it's not enough. I need to be honest. The government need to be honest, to be transparent in their way, in their policy. It's not about political. It's about ecological. Ecology that beyond politics. And then we must really stand together. To save what is left. And I have hope in Sumatra because of the lesser ecosystem. The lesser ecosystem is the last stronghold for the survival of the orangutans, elephants, tiger, and rhino. But not only that, but also it gives a lot of services for people, for the economy, for the livelihood, for the local people in Sumatra. So by doing all this work so far for the last 15 years, I feel sometimes really hopeful, sometimes really hopeless, because things sometimes doesn't really work well on the ground, and when things are going wrong, it's being ignored. And now the government need to open their eyes without having any chance to even ignore any single case. And this has to be maintained. And what we need to do actually, we have to find ways. There's a better way to fix the problem. I believe what we have been doing now maybe not perfect, but at least we can maintain something good, to do something real but making impact on the ground, and we must maintain this. And I still sometimes want to say that it's a responsibility of anyone, but the biggest responsibility must be actually given to the government.
Well, thank you, and thank you to our guests. The fires and the haze that resulted from those fires have been devastating to Southeast Asia, particularly to Indonesia, but to a number of countries and regions. They may be the biggest environmental crime of the 21st century, as Eric has proposed, but perhaps they're occurring at the right time. The eyes of the world are currently on Paris, and the Climate Change Conference is currently underway. And these fires are a clear indicator that the world is not well, and we cannot continue with business as usual. So hopefully there will be a positive outcome from this catastrophe. I certainly can, speaking for the Great Ape Survival Partnership, we believe very strongly that there is hope for the future, and our mandate is to protect great apes and their habitat for the future, and certainly this is an opportunity. So with that, I'd like to thank our four guests today, Eric Maillard, Jamie Webb, Haji Claire, and Panut Hadiswoyo, for joining us on this webcast to talk about the Indonesian crisis. And I'd like to wish them all well, and to wish all those at the Paris Climate Change Conference the best of luck, and here's hoping that solid and progressive policy comes out of that conference. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good luck, Panut.
Thank you, Haji. Good luck to everybody. Bye, Eric.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.